My uncle laughed and called me a sentimental loser when I tried to save my grandfather's legacy. There's something about standing on the porch of your childhood home that makes time collapse. I'm 31 now, but suddenly I feel 15 again, with my whole life ahead of me and my grandfather's voice guiding the way. That's where I found myself last week, on the worn wooden steps of my late grandfather Art's house in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, feeling like I'd stepped through a portal back to 1975. The house hasn't changed in decades. Same faded blue paint. Same creaky screen door that announces every visitor with a distinctive squeak slam. Same mailbox with Donovan hand-painted in Grandpa's precise lettering. But everything else has changed, because Grandpa Art isn't here anymore. He passed 3 weeks ago. Heart attack while gardening. Quick and painless, the doctor said. Like he just decided it was time to join my grandma and Mom on the other side. I hadn't processed it yet. Couldn't, which is why I was standing frozen on his porch, trying to work up the courage to go inside. The smell hit me first when I opened the door, that unmistakable mix of old carpet, pipe tobacco, and vinyl records. My chest tightened. This house was my refuge after Mom died when I was 15. Dad had checked out emotionally years before, so it was Grandpa Art who stepped in. He was my rock, my compass, my best friend. I ran my fingers along the wallpaper in the hallway, remembering how Grandpa used to measure my height there every birthday. "Another inch toward the sky, Michael," he'd say, marking the wall with a pencil and the date. Those marks are still there, chronicling my growth from a gangly teenager to a full-grown man. In the living room, everything remained exactly as he left it. His recliner still had the dent from where he sat every evening. His pipe rested on the side table next to a dog-eared Louis L'Amour Western, and in the corner stood his pride and joy, a 1960s Grundig console stereo, surrounded by shelves of vinyl records organized by genre and year. I can still hear him saying, "Michael, music is like a letter from God. Only a fool burns it without reading." He'd sit me down on Saturday afternoons, pull out a record, maybe the Beatles, maybe Sinatra, maybe some obscure blues artist, and tell me to really listen, not just with my ears, but with my heart. "Some songs aren't meant to be background noise," he'd say. "They're meant to be experienced." I was lost in memories when the back door banged open and my Uncle Roy stormed in like he owned the place. Technically, I guess he did now. As Grandpa's only living son, he'd inherited everything. "About time you showed up," he grunted, barely looking at me. "I'm clearing this place out tomorrow. Take what you want, then get lost." Uncle Roy and I have never seen eye to eye. He's the practical one, the businessman, the guy who measures everything by its resale value on eBay. He thought Grandpa was a sentimental old fool who never moved with the times. He couldn't understand why his father lived in this small house with outdated everything when he could have sold it and moved to a modern condo. I watched in horror as Roy started grabbing boxes of records and hauling them toward the back door. "What are you doing with those?" I asked, my voice rising an octave. "Trash," he said simply. "Garbage pickups tomorrow. No one wants this ancient junk." I rushed after him to the backyard where he'd already tossed several boxes. The sight made me physically ill, vinyl records scattered across the dirt, some already cracked under Roy's heavy work boots as he stomped back and forth. "Are you crazy? These are Grandpa's records. His whole collection." Roy picked up an Elvis Presley album, holding it like it was a dirty diaper. "This what you came for? This garbage?" I tried explaining that vinyl was making a comeback, that collectors paid good money for original pressings, that these weren't just records, they were Grandpa's passion, his legacy. Roy just snorted. "You want M? Pay up. $100 a box, another 100 for that clacking record player. Otherwise, they're landfill by tomorrow afternoon, you sentimental loser." I stared at him, stunned. This was Grandpa's brother's son? They couldn't possibly share the same DNA. I could almost hear Grandpa Art's voice in my head. "Some people only hear the jingle of coins, Michael, but music sounds louder if you'll just listen." I checked my wallet. $50 and a credit card screaming, "Don't do it." My rent was due next week, and guitar lessons don't exactly pay Wall Street salaries. But I couldn't walk away. These weren't just vinyl discs. They were evenings with Grandpa, listening to the Beatles while he told me how he once helped some British band during a sound check in Chicago back in the 60s. They were the summer he taught me to dance, so I wouldn't embarrass myself at prom. The Christmas he played Bing Crosby and baked cookies that were somehow both burned and undercooked. The night after Mom's funeral, when he put on her favorite Carole King album and just sat with me in silence because he knew no words would help. I called my buddy Dave. I need to borrow $200. Right now, it's an emergency. 20 minutes later, Dave pulled up in his beat-up Jeep. I grabbed the cash and marched back to Roy. Here, $200. Now back off my records. Roy counted the bills slowly, a smirk spreading across his face. Seriously? You're spending your last dime on this junk? You really are Art's grandson. He shook his head like I was the world's biggest sucker. Go ahead, take it all. You'll regret wasting money on this trash when your car breaks down next month. I ignored him and started carefully gathering the scattered vinyl, checking each for cracks. Most had survived Roy's carelessness. I packed them lovingly into boxes, then wrestled Grandpa's Grundig stereo console out to my truck with Dave's help. As we loaded the last box, Roy called from the porch. By the way, I'm selling the house to developers. They're tearing it down next month to build condos, in case you want to take pictures or whatever sentimental crap you do. Another gut punch, but I was beyond feeling by then. Dave helped me haul everything back to my small apartment on the other side of Lancaster. We barely managed to get the stereo up the narrow staircase, scraping my knuckles raw in the process. Man, I hope these records are worth something, Dave said, wiping sweat from his brow. Otherwise, you just spent your rent money on the world's heaviest drink coasters. I just nodded. I wasn't thinking about their monetary value. I was thinking about Grandpa Art's voice. The things that matter most, kid, aren't always worth much to others, but that doesn't make them worthless. That night, after Dave left, I sat on my apartment floor surrounded by cardboard boxes of vinyl. My back ached from moving the stereo. My hands were cut and bruised. My wallet was empty. And tomorrow I'd have to figure out how to make rent. Had I made a colossal mistake? Was I really just a sentimental fool who couldn't let go of the past? Or was there something more to Grandpa's insistence that I should always listen to the music? I carefully set up the old stereo in the corner of my living room, surprised it still worked after all these years. I pulled out a random record, Abbey Road, and placed it on the turntable. The needle dropped with that familiar hiss and crackle that digital music has sanitized away. And then magic, come together, filled my tiny apartment with a warmth that no digital stream could ever replicate. I closed my eyes and was instantly transported back to Grandpa's living room, watching him tap his foot in his recliner, pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling. There it is. I could almost hear him say, "That's the heartbeat of the universe right there." I opened the first box and began sorting through Grandpa's collection, one record at a time. Each album cover was like a time capsule. Some had little notes written in Grandpa's neat handwriting on the inside sleeves. Chicago 1965 played this after seeing them live. Christmas 69, Catherine's favorite. Michael's first record, age 16. I stayed up all night, surrounded by vinyl, memories washing over me with each album I rediscovered. Sleep seemed less important than this communion with my past, with Grandpa's legacy. As dawn broke, I reached the bottom of the third box and found something strange, a record without a proper sleeve, just a white paper cover with a handwritten label. For Alan, thanks for being our first believer, JL. I stared at it, puzzled. Who was JL? And why did the handwriting look so familiar, like I'd seen it before on some album cover or magazine? I carefully placed it on the turntable, not knowing that this one record, this piece of junk my Uncle Roy had nearly thrown away, was about to change my life forever. As the needle found its groove, I wondered, was I truly an idiot for spending my last dollars on these old records? Or was this the beginning of something I couldn't yet imagine? The next few weeks of my life became a blur of vinyl records and memories. My tiny Lancaster apartment transformed into something between a music archive and a shrine to Grandpa art. Those boxes took over every available inch of space, stacked against walls, under tables, beside my bed. I could barely find a path to walk from my sofa to the kitchen. My entire living space was now dominated by Grandpa's musical legacy. Every night after work at the music store, I'd come home, microwave whatever was cheapest at the grocery store that week, crack open a beer, and dive into another box of records. It became my ritual, my therapy, my obsession. I felt like an archaeologist uncovering ancient treasures. Each album was a time capsule with its own story, its own connection to Grandpa's life, and by extension, to mine. I started cataloging everything in a spreadsheet, noting condition, year, any special markings or notes Grandpa had made. The collection was remarkable. Over 800 records spanning from the 1940s to the 1980s. Multiple genres, some incredibly rare, all meticulously cared for. Even after sitting in Grandpa's house for decades, most were in near-mint condition. He'd taught me how to handle vinyl properly when I was just a kid. Always by the edges, Michael. The oils in your fingers are the enemy of good sound. I found the B.B. King album. He played the night. He told me about meeting my grandmother at a dance hall in 1958. She was wearing a blue dress, he'd said, eyes distant with memory. Looked like a summer sky come down to earth. Then there was the Byrds album he used to teach me to dance before my high school prom. He cleared the furniture from his living room and demonstrated steps that were probably cool in 1965. I clomped around like a bear with sore feet while he patiently counted 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. By the end of the night, I could just barely avoid crushing my date's toes. A success by our standards. I laughed through tears remembering how he'd say, "Michael, life is like vinyl. Sometimes it crackles, sometimes it skips, but if you listen all the way through, it's worth it." I listened to each record, making notes like I was writing in a diary. It felt like Grandpa was there with me, telling me stories through music. Some nights I'd fall asleep on the floor surrounded by album covers, waking up with liner notes stuck to my face, and the record player needle clicking repeatedly against a label. My boss at Lancaster Sound and Music started noticing my bloodshot eyes and gave me concerned looks. "You going through something, Mike?" he asked once. I just shrugged. How could I explain that I was having nightly conversations with my dead grandfather through a stack of plastic discs? I kept finding records with Grandpa's handwriting on the sleeves. Chicago, 1965, purchased after the show. New York, 1967, waited 6 hours in line. Alan's recommendation, summer of '63. Alan, that name kept appearing throughout the collection. I remembered Grandpa mentioning an Alan who'd been his buddy during his days as a sound engineer in Chicago. They'd lost touch in the '70s. But Grandpa always spoke of him with a mixture of fondness and respect. Alan had ears like a bat, he'd say. Could pick out a slightly detuned string in a 12-piece band. I was deep into the fourth box when I found it. That mysterious record without a proper sleeve, just a plain white paper cover with a handwritten note. For Alan, thanks for being our first believer, JL. I studied the handwriting. Something about it seemed eerily familiar, like I'd seen it somewhere before. Not Grandpa's neat script. This was more relaxed, almost artistic. And those initials, JL, why did they send a shiver down my spine? I carefully placed the record on the turntable, lowered the needle, and held my breath. The sound that filled my apartment wasn't what I expected. It was in my life, a Beatles song I'd heard 100 times before. But this wasn't the version everyone knows. This was raw, intimate, like being in the studio with them. No orchestration, just acoustic guitar and that unmistakable voice, John Lennon. Singing with emotion that felt almost uncomfortable to witness, like reading someone's private diary. The hair on my arm stood up. This wasn't a commercial release. This was something else entirely. I played it 3 times in a row, noticing different details each time. A slight vocal break, an alternate lyric, the sound of someone shifting on a chair in the background. Grandpa's voice echoed in my head. "Music isn't a thing, Michael. It's a moment you can hold in your hands." I pulled my laptop over and typed a message to a vinyl collector's forum I joined while cataloging collection. Found unusual Beatles record. In my life, that sounds like a studio demo. White sleeve, handwritten note. For Alan, thanks for being our first believer. Jill, anyone know what this might be? I expected to wait days for a response, if I got one at all. But within 30 minutes, my inbox exploded. Messages popped up so quickly I couldn't read them all. Are you serious? Pics or it didn't happen. Don't play it again until you have it authenticated. Where did you find this? One message stood out from a user named Vinyl Vulture, who seemed more knowledgeable than the others. If what you're describing is authentic, you may have found a holy grail record. That could be a test pressing of In My Life before Rubber Soul's release. Can you send photos of the label and the handwritten note? Don't share these publicly. My hand shook as I carefully photographed the record and its handwritten sleeve. I hesitated before hitting send. Something told me my life was about to change, and I wasn't sure I was ready. I thought about what Uncle Roy would say if this turned out to be valuable. He'd probably sue me faster than you can say probate court. I hadn't exactly been transparent about finding anything special in those boxes he'd sold me for $200. But curiosity won out. I sent the photos to Vinyl Vulture and waited, pacing my small apartment, suddenly aware how vulnerable these cardboard boxes of vinyl were. What if there was a fire? A break-in? Should I be keeping potentially valuable records in a place where the radiator regularly tried to cook us alive in winter? 20 minutes later, my phone rang, an unknown number. I rarely answer those, but something told me I should. Is this Michael Donovan? A woman's voice asked. Yes. This is Patricia Winters from Vinyl Archaeology magazine. One of our contributors forwarded me your forum post about a possible Beatles test pressing. I'd like to verify what you found. My mouth went dry. How did you get my number? Your forum profile. Look, I understand your skepticism, but if this is authentic, it's incredibly significant. These records were thought to be completely lost. Her knowledge seemed legitimate, but my stranger danger alarms were blaring. I'd grown up in the don't talk to people from the internet generation. I appreciate your interest, I said carefully, but I'm still trying to understand what I have here. Maybe we can talk after I've had it properly evaluated. She sighed. I understand, but please be careful. If word gets out about this, you'll have collectors and dealers descending on you like vultures. So it might not be entirely ethical. After we hung up, I sat on my couch feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's life. 24 hours ago, I was just a guy who taught guitar lessons and worked at a music store. Now I was getting calls from magazine editors about possibly rare Beatles recordings. My laptop pinged with a message from Vinyl Vulture. Based on your photos, I'm 99% sure you have an authentic pre-release test pressing of In My Life with John Lennon's actual handwriting. The Alan mentioned is almost certainly Alan Williams, who helped the Beatles early in their career. If genuine, this is museum-quality material. Depending on condition and authentication, we're talking potentially 7 figures. Do not tell anyone else about this. Don't play it again. Don't touch it. Find a professional music authenticator immediately. I can recommend someone discreet. 7 figures? As in millions? I laughed out loud, certain this was some elaborate prank. People like me didn't just stumble across million-dollar records in their grandfather's collection. That happened in movies, not real life. But then I remembered Grandpa's stories about working sound in Chicago during the 60s, how he'd occasionally drop hints about meeting famous musicians. I'd always assumed he was embellishing, the way grandparents do to impress their grandkids. What if he wasn't exaggerating? What if he really did have connections to the Beatles through this Alan person? I pulled out my phone and Googled Alan Williams Beatles. Sure enough, there he was, described as the man who gave the Beatles away, their first manager before Brian Epstein. He died in 2016, but he'd been there at the very beginning. My mind reeled. Had my grandfather known Alan Williams? Had this record been gifted to Williams by John Lennon himself, then somehow made its way to Grandpa Art? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the phone call from Patricia and a message from Vinyl Vulture. I got up around 3 a.m. and moved all the records into my bedroom, paranoid that someone might break in overnight. As I carefully transported the mysterious Beatles record, I noticed something I had missed before, a small piece of paper tucked into the sleeve. It was a black and white photograph, creased and faded with age. 3 young men stood behind a soundboard. One was clearly a younger version of my grandfather, another I didn't recognize, and the third... I squinted in the dim light. No way. It couldn't be. But it was. John Lennon, looking hardly older than a teenager, arms slung casually around my grandfather's shoulders. They were all smiling, cigarettes in hand, looking like regular guys hanging out after work. On the back, in my grandfather's neat handwriting, Chicago, 1963. Me, Alan, and John after the sound check. I sat on my bed, photo in one hand, record in the other, as the pieces started clicking together. Grandpa wasn't just a fan who collected records. He had been there. He had known these people. This wasn't just memorabilia. This was his life. I remembered something else he used to say. The most valuable things you'll ever own are the ones that tell your story. The next morning, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, I replied to Vinyl Vulture asking for the name of that authenticator. Then I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Within an hour, I received contact information for a music authenticator in New York City, someone who had worked with major auction houses and museums. I called and explained my situation, carefully omitting specific details about what I'd found. The authenticator, a Dr. Stevens, agreed to see me the following week. His tone shifted noticeably when I mentioned the Beatles' connection, becoming both more interested and more cautious. As I hung up, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard you might have something interesting. Would pay top dollar. No questions asked. Cash deal. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't told anyone except Vinyl Vulture and that magazine editor. How was word spreading so quickly? My hands trembled as I placed the record and photo in a secure inner sleeve, then inside a hard-shell case I borrowed from work. I tucked it between my mattress and box spring. Not exactly Fort Knox, but the best I could do on short notice. That night, as I drifted off to sleep surrounded by Grandpa's vinyl collection, I wondered, had he known what he was leaving me? Was this intentional, or just a happy accident? And most importantly, what the hell was I supposed to do now? One thing was becoming clear. My grandfather had left me far more than just memories, and my hands were shaking at the thought of what might come next. The week before my appointment with Dr. Stevens in New York felt like the longest of my life. I barely slept. Every creak in my apartment building sent me bolting upright, convinced someone had broken in to steal the record. I started carrying it with me everywhere in a padded laptop bag, which probably wasn't any safer, but at least gave me the illusion of control. The online vinyl community was losing their collective minds. Vinyl Vulture had apparently shared the news, though thankfully not my identity, with select collectors, and rumors were spreading. My original forum post disappeared, replaced by a message from moderators about unverified claims. But that only fueled the speculation. I received 3 more unsolicited offers to buy the record sight unseen, one for $50,000 cash, no questions asked. It was surreal. A month ago, I was just a guitar teacher struggling to make rent, with $127 in my checking account and a maxed-out credit card. Now strangers were offering me more money than I'd ever seen in my life for something my Uncle Roy had literally been stomping on. I called in sick again and drove my beat-up Toyota to New York City, the record securely tucked into a fireproof document bag I'd panic-bought online. The whole way there, I kept imagining scenarios where I'd get carjacked or the record would somehow get damaged. Grandpa's voice kept echoing in my head. Worry is interest paid on trouble that hasn't happened yet, Michael. Dr. Stevens worked out of a nondescript office in a secure building near NYU. He was exactly as I'd imagined mid-60s. White beard like Santa Claus, wire-rimmed glasses, elbow patches on his tweed jacket. A walking stereotype of an academic, down to the slight British accent. When I placed the record on his desk, his professional demeanor cracked slightly. His hands trembled as he carefully removed it from my protective sleeve. He examined the vinyl under specialized lights, photographed the label from multiple angles, and studied the handwriting with a magnifying glass. "May I?" he asked, pointing to his turntable, a museum-quality piece that probably cost more than my car. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He placed the record on the platter, with the care of someone handling a newborn. When the needle dropped and John Lennon's voice filled the room, Dr. Stevens closed his eyes, listening with complete concentration. After the song ended, he sat in silence for nearly a full minute. Then he carefully returned the record to its sleeve and looked at me over his glasses. "Mr. Donovan, what you have here is extraordinary. It's a pre-production test pressing of My Life, made before the final version that appeared on Rubber Soul. The Matrix number confirms it's from a very limited run. Probably no more than 5 copies were ever made. And this particular copy," he tapped the handwritten note. "This was personally gifted by John Lennon to Alan Williams, who was indeed an early supporter of the band." He adjusted his glasses and continued. "Based on the photographic evidence you provided showing your grandfather with both Williams and Lennon, I believe I can reconstruct the provenance. Alan Williams likely gave or sold this record to your grandfather sometime in the mid to late 1960s. The chain of ownership is clear, and the authenticity is, in my professional opinion, beyond doubt. I must have looked like I was about to pass out, because Dr. Stevens poured me a glass of water from a carafe on his desk. Do you understand what this means, Mr. Donovan?" I took a sip of water. "It's valuable?" He chuckled. "That's rather like saying the Hope Diamond is shiny. This is one of the most significant Beatles artifacts to surface in decades. With proper authentication papers, which I am prepared to provide, this could easily fetch 7 figures at auction." 7 figures, meaning millions. With an M, I laughed nervously. This can't be real. Things like this don't happen to regular guys like me. Dr. Stevens smiled. "I've been authenticating music memorabilia for 30 years, Mr. Donovan. Every significant find has a story behind it, and most don't involve Indiana Jones types. They involve ordinary people like yourself who had a connection to someone who was briefly in the right place at the right time in music history." He slid a business card across the desk. "This is Christie's. Ask for Margaret Chun. Tell her I sent you. She handles their music memorabilia auctions." As I carefully packed up the record, Dr. Stevens added, "And Mr. Donovan, I suggest you get insurance. Immediately." The next few weeks passed in a blur. I took out a special insurance policy that nearly wiped out my savings. I met with Margaret Chun, who practically squealed when she saw Dr. Stevens' authentication papers. I signed contracts I barely understood, even after a lawyer friend explained them. Margaret suggested a reserve price that made me laugh until I realized she was serious. I quit my job at the music store, though I kept teaching guitar lessons. Partly because I needed some income until the auction, but mostly because I didn't want to disconnect from the thing that had originally connected me to Grandpa art music. 2 days before the auction, I got a call from an unknown number. "Mikey, it's your Uncle Roy. How's it going, buddy?" His sudden friendly tone made my skin crawl. We hadn't spoken since the day I'd hauled away Grandpa's junk. "What do you want, Roy?" "Can an uncle check in on his favorite nephew? Listen, I heard through the grapevine that you found something interesting in those old records I sold you." My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know? I'd been careful. Only a handful of people knew my identity. "I don't know what you're talking about." I lied. "Come on, Mikey. We're family. I'm talking about that Beatles record that's heading to Christie's next week. Small town, big gossip. My buddy's cousin works security there." I remained silent, mind racing. "Look," Roy continued, his voice suddenly all business. "That record came from your grandfather's estate, which I inherited. Legally, half of whatever you get belongs to me." I laughed out loud. "Are you serious? You sold me those records, Roy. You called them worthless junk. You were literally stomping on them in the backyard. We had a transaction, $200 for the whole lot. That's what they were worth to you." "That was before I knew what was in there," he sputtered. "Not my problem. You made the deal. I've got the receipt you wrote out." It's legally mine now. We'll see what my lawyer says about that, he threatened before hanging up. The day of the auction arrived. I'd never felt more out of place than I did walking into Christie's in New York, wearing the only suit I owned, the one I bought for Grandpa's funeral. Everyone else looked like they'd stepped out of a fashion magazine or a Wall Street boardroom. Margaret showed me my seat, front row, but off to the side where I could observe without being observed. The auction catalog listed my record simply as Lot 42, extremely rare Beatles test pressing with John Lennon autograph. No mention of my name or Grandpa's, as I'd requested. Are you ready? Margaret whispered, squeezing my shoulder. I wasn't, not even close. But I nodded anyway. The first 41 lots passed in a daze. I couldn't focus on the Elvis jumpsuits or the signed Hendrix guitars that sold for more money than I'd ever made in a year. All I could think about was what was coming next. And then suddenly, there was a photograph of my record projected on the screen behind the auctioneer. He described it in terms that made it sound like the holy grail of music memorabilia, which I suppose it was. We'll start the bidding at $500,000, he announced. 5 seconds later, we were at $1 million. 10 seconds after that, $1.5 million. The numbers kept climbing in increments that made me dizzy. $2 million, 2.5. I stopped breathing when we hit $3 million. The auctioneer scanned the room. I have $3 million from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear $3,100,000? A small woman in the corner raised her paddle. $3,100,000 to the lady in black. Any advance on $3,100,000? The room fell silent. The man who bid $3 million shook his head. $3,100,000 going once, going twice. The auctioneer paused dramatically, scanning the room one final time. Sold for $3,100,000. And just like that, it was over. My grandfather's junk had just sold for more money than I could comprehend. After Christie's commission and taxes, I'd clear around $2.5 million. I sat frozen in my chair as the room emptied for a break before the next session. Margaret appeared at my side, beaming. "Congratulations," she whispered. "One of our best music sales this year." I tried to respond, but no words came out. All I could hear was Grandpa Art's voice in my head. "Michael, what's valuable isn't what costs a lot. It's what you can't let go of." I let go of the record, but somehow I felt closer to him than ever. As I walked out in a daze, a security guard handed me an envelope. "From the buyer," he explained. Inside was a note on elegant stationery. "The record is going to Rock and Roll Hall of Fame where it belongs. Your grandfather would be proud. R.M." I stumbled out onto the New York sidewalk, a soon-to-be millionaire who couldn't afford a taxi without maxing out his credit card. The irony made me laugh out loud, drawing strange looks from passers-by. 2 days later, the money hit my bank account. I stared at the balance on my phone screen for 10 minutes straight, not quite believing it was real. Then I did something I've been wanting to do for days. I drove back to Lancaster and headed straight to Holbein, the little coffee shop where I'd spent countless hours nursing a single cup of coffee while working on song lyrics I never finished. I ordered my usual plain black coffee and sat by the window, pulling up the Beatles version of In My Life on my phone. As John Lennon sang about places he remembered, I thought about Grandpa Art's house, now sold to developers who would tear it down and build condos. I thought about all the stories contained in those vinyl grooves that now fill my apartment. I thought about how a single record had completely changed my life in less than 2 months. The song ended, and I sipped my coffee, wondering what to do next. I'd never imagined having this kind of money. I could travel the world, buy a house, invest it, and live off the interest. But none of those options felt right. My phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Roy. "This isn't over." Attached was a photo of a legal letter threatening to contest the sale. I should have been stressed, but instead I laughed. What was he going to do? I had the receipt where he'd sold me the junk for $200. I had witnesses who saw him stomping on the records in the backyard. No judge in the world would side with him. Still, family drama was the last thing I wanted to deal with right now. I texted back, "It is Over, Roy. You got what you wanted, Grandpa's house. I got what I wanted, his music. Let's leave it at that. No response came, which was probably for the best. As I sat there, my mind drifted to something Grandpa used to say when I complained about school or girls or my parents' divorce. The question isn't, why is this happening to me? The question is, what am I going to do with it? What was I going to do with a sudden windfall of millions? The answer should have been obvious, but it wasn't. I looked around the coffee shop. It was cozy, with exposed brick walls and Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Local artwork adorned the walls, and a small corner stage hosted acoustic performances on weekends. People of all ages sat chatting, working on laptops, or just enjoying a moment of peace. And then it hit me, what Grandpa would have wanted me to do with the money. Not buy a mansion or a sports car. Not hide it away in investments, though I'd certainly do some of that. But the bulk of it should continue what Grandpa Art had started, creating a space where music could bring people together across generations. I pulled out my notebook and started sketching ideas. A cafe, but with a twist. A place where vinyl wasn't just background noise, but the main event. Where Grandpa's collection could live on, not gathering dust in my apartment, but being enjoyed by everyone. A place that honored the past while creating new memories. On my way home, I drove past a vacant storefront on Main Street that had once been a bookstore. It had good bones, brick walls, high ceilings, big windows. I pulled over and peered inside, already imagining what it could become. The next day, I called a number on the for lease sign. The day after that, I met with a commercial real estate agent. Within a week, I had signed a 5-year lease with an option to buy. Uncle Roy's lawyer sent another threatening letter. I forwarded it to the lawyer I'd hired, a no-nonsense woman who specialized in estate disputes. She sent back a response so firmly worded that we never heard from Roy's side again. Sometimes I think about how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't begged and borrowed to buy those worthless records. If I'd listened to the voice of practicality instead of sentiment. If I'd been the kind of person who could walk away from a physical embodiment of memories. Grandpa used to say, the best things in life are surprises that come from choices made with the heart instead of the head. As I sit here now, sipping coffee and watching people mill about the space that will soon become something new, something that honors both the past and the future, I can't help but think he was right. Turns out there's a world of difference between having a good idea and actually executing it. The 6 months between signing the lease and opening Vinyl and Memories Cafe were the most exhausting of my life. Contractors who ghosted mid-project, permit applications that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, equipment deliveries delayed by supply chain issues. I learned more about commercial plumbing codes and fire safety regulations than any human should ever know. But standing here now, keys in hand, looking at the finished space the night before our grand opening, every headache seems worth it. The place is exactly what I'd envisioned that day sitting in Holbein Coffee Shop, dreaming up a tribute to Grandpa Art. Exposed brick walls, warmed by Edison bulbs and vintage fixtures. Comfortable seating arranged in conversational clusters rather than rigid rows. A polished concrete bar where baristas will craft drinks named after classic songs. And the centerpiece, a listening area with Grandpa's restored Grundig console and carefully curated shelves of vinyl from his collection. I named it Vinyl and Memories Cafe. Not just a coffee shop, but my thank you letter to Grandpa. His photos lined the walls. Young art in his sound engineer days, middle-aged art with my mom at her high school graduation, older art teaching teenage me to play guitar. Between the photos hang framed handwritten quotes. I remember him saying, "Music is like a letter from God. Only a fool burns it without reading." And the best things in life are surprises that come from choices made with the heart instead of the head. I spent weeks designing the menu as a love letter to the 60s and 70s. Blackbird Brew, dark roast with notes of blackberry. Moondance Mocha, chocolate and cinnamon. Strawberry Latte Forever, strawberry and vanilla. The local newspaper called it delightfully nostalgic without being kitschy, probably the best compliment possible. Opening day arrived with a line around the block, a mix of curious locals and vinyl enthusiasts who'd heard about us through social media. An elderly couple who had to be in their 80s were first through the door, the woman clutching her husband's arm as she gasped at the record collection. "Harold, look. They have the first pressing of Kinda Blue we danced to at our wedding." She turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Young man, what you created here is special. Music needs physical spaces like this." I nearly lost it right then. If I'd had any doubts about spending a chunk of my auction windfall on this place instead of just investing it all, they vanished in that moment. The first week was a blur of 16-hour days, learning curves, and unexpected challenges. We ran out of oat milk 3 times. The espresso machine developed a mind of its own. One of the vintage speakers blew out during an enthusiastic playthrough of Led Zeppelin II. But we also had moments of pure magic. A group of college students discovering vinyl for the first time, their faces lighting up at the warmth of analog sound. A tattooed guy in his 30s who sat silently listening to Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks, tears streaming down his face, later telling me it was his father's favorite album, and today would have been his birthday. He would have loved this place, he said before leaving, and I felt like Grandpa Art was somehow watching, nodding in approval. Friday nights quickly became memory sessions, where customers could bring their own special records and share the stories behind them. Some nights were rowdy and fun, people dancing to disco hits or headbanging to classic rock. Other nights turned unexpectedly profound, as when a Vietnam veteran brought in a Creedence Clearwater Revival album that followed him through the war. 3 weeks in, just as we were finding our rhythm, a woman walked in during a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Dark curly hair, glasses with tortoiseshell frames, carrying a shoulder bag emblazoned with the NPR logo. Something about her made me fumble the mug I was cleaning. "Hi," she said, glancing around appreciatively. "Are you Michael Donovan?" I nodded, suddenly aware of my wrinkled apron and the coffee stains on my jeans. "I'm Kate Winters from NPR's American Soundscapes. We're doing a feature on new businesses preserving musical heritage. Your place keeps coming up in my research." Kate from NPR, with her warm brown eyes and a smile that made my brain short-circuit. I offered her a tour, managing to string together somewhat coherent sentences as I showed her around. She recorded everything on a professional-grade device, asking thoughtful questions about Grandpa Art, the Beatles record, and my vision for the cafe. "Mind if I come back Friday for your memory session?" she asked. "I'd love to capture some of the stories your customers share." She returned that Friday and the next, and then started showing up for coffee at random times, sometimes with her recording equipment, sometimes just to hang out. We'd talk about everything. Her grandfather who played saxophone in jazz clubs in the 50s, my dreams of someday writing music instead of just playing other people's songs, our shared belief that digital streaming had sacrificed something essential about how we experience music. "You know," she said one evening as we closed up, "your cafe is like vinyl itself. Not trendy, but authentic. People respond to that." The NPR piece aired in June, and suddenly Vinyl and Memories wasn't just a local curiosity. People started making detours on their East Coast road trips to visit us. A music blog called us one of 10 analog experiences worth having in a digital world. Our Instagram follower count jumped from a few hundred to over 20,000 in a week. Then came the TikTok that changed everything. A college student filmed me telling the story of Grandpa Art and John Lennon while playing a commercially released version of In My Life. Her video went viral. Over 1 million views in 24 hours. Suddenly we had lines down the block every weekend. People were driving from neighboring states to sip a yesterday cappuccino and listen to vinyl they remember from their youth or were discovering for the first time. Our small staff of 5 had to expand to 12. I hired a manager because I couldn't keep up with the day-to-day operations alone anymore. Local musicians started asking if they could perform acoustic sets in the evenings. We extended our hours, added a small food menu, and still couldn't keep up with demand. 6 months after opening, I stood behind the counter watching a diverse crowd of people enjoying the space. Teenagers experiencing Fleetwood Mac for the first time, retirees reliving their youth through Simon and Garfunkel, middle-aged men debating the merits of early versus late Beatles albums. I thought about what Grandpa Art would say if he could see this place. "Music isn't meant to be experienced alone, Michael," he'd always insisted. It's a conversation between the artist, the listener, and everyone who's ever been moved by the same notes. In the middle of this reflection, Kate appeared at the counter, coffee mug in hand. "Refill for your most loyal customer?" she asked with that smile that still made me forget basic English. We'd been dancing around something more than friendship for months. Professional ethics had kept her at a distance while working on her story, but that had aired weeks ago, and still, here she was almost every day. "I've been thinking," she said, leaning on the counter. "I'm doing a follow-up piece on how technology preserves or erases cultural memory. Would you want to be interviewed again? Maybe over dinner this time? Off the record, of course." That dinner led to another and another, until Kate became as much a fixture in my life as the cafe itself. She understood my connection to Grandpa's music in a way no one else had. Her own grandfather had left her his collection of jazz records and a passion for storytelling that led her to NPR. "We're both living in the echo of good men," she said once, her head on my shoulder as we listened to Miles Davis on our couch. I couldn't have put it better myself. Between Kate, the cafe, and occasionally still teaching guitar to a few longtime students, life settled into a rhythm I'd never imagined possible. Every morning I'd wake up grateful that I'd fought for those worthless vinyl records, that I'd somehow stumbled into this life that felt perfectly tailored to who I was meant to be. Nearly a year after opening, I was organizing a delivery of vintage record cleaning supplies when I noticed a familiar Ford F-150 parking across the street. Uncle Roy climbed out, looking older and more worn than the last time I'd seen him. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, just staring at the cafe's facade. My chest tightened. The legal threats had stopped months ago after my lawyer's stern response, but I hadn't heard directly from Roy since. What was he doing here? Was he about to make a scene? Should I call the police preemptively? Instead, I watched as he simply entered the cafe like any other customer, removed his baseball cap, and looked around with an unreadable expression. I finished with the delivery guy and headed inside, finding Roy sitting alone at a table near the window, awkwardly holding a menu. He looked up as I approached. "Nice place," he said gruffly. "Looks like you've done well for yourself." I slid into the chair across from him, tense and wary. "What do you want, Roy?" He set the menu down and sighed, suddenly looking every one of 60-plus years. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just curious about what you did with all that money. Wanted to see for myself." Despite everything, he was still family. My mom's brother, Grandpa's son. And looking at him now, I could see small echoes of both of them in his face. "Can I get you something? Coffee? We have some great blends." He nodded, seeming relieved at the neutral response. "Whatever you recommend." I brought him our house special and a slice of apple pie. As I set them down, I noticed him studying a photo of Grandpa on the wall, a younger version of him setting up microphones on a small stage. "I remember that day," Roy said quietly. "Dad was doing sound for a local folk festival. I was maybe 10. He let me help run cables." It was the first time I'd ever heard him refer to Grandpa with anything resembling fondness. For a moment, I glimpsed the complicated relationship they must have had, the son who chose practical business versus the father who followed his passion for music. We talked cautiously at first, then more openly. Roy admitted he'd been harsh about Grandpa's belongings, that he'd been dealing with his own complicated grief. I showed him how I'd incorporated Grandpa's vinyl collection into the cafe, how people came specifically to connect with the music he curated. "You were right to fight me for these records," Roy admitted, surprising me. "I wouldn't have done this." He gestured around at the bustling cafe. "I would have just sold everything for whatever I could get and never thought about it again." Before leaving, he awkwardly patted my shoulder. "Your mom would have been proud. Kid. Dad, too." After Roy left, I wandered to the cafe in a daze, seeing it with fresh eyes. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across the wooden floors. The gentle crackle of vinyl provided a backdrop to the murmur of conversations. The walls lined with Grandpa's albums told a story spanning decades of musical history. On the street outside, I noticed a new billboard had gone up, one I hadn't commissioned. In bold vintage-inspired lettering it read, Vinyl and memories, where old songs find new hearts. It took me a moment to realize Kate must have arranged it as a surprise, knowing we were approaching our one-year anniversary. Standing there, watching people enjoy the space I created, I finally understood something Grandpa had told me years ago. We don't own music, Michael. We're just its temporary caretakers, passing it along to whoever needs to hear it next. That evening, after closing, Kate and I slow danced in the empty cafe to Sam Cooke's Bring It On Home to Me on Grandpa's old record player. As we swayed between the tables, I caught sight of our shadow on the brick wall. Two figures merged into one, moving to music created decades before either of us was born. What are you thinking about? Kate murmured against my shoulder. That this isn't just a business, I answered. It's my calling. She smiled up at me. I knew that the first day I walked in here. As we locked up that night, I felt a sense of completion I'd never experienced before. The journey from standing on Grandpa's porch watching Uncle Roy stomp on vinyl records to creating this thriving community space felt both impossibly unlikely and somehow inevitable. The cafe had become exactly what I'd hoped, a place where Grandpa's love of music lived on, where people connected across generations through vinyl grooves, where memories were both preserved and created anew each day. I turned the sign to closed and took one last look around before hitting the lights. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new stories, new music to share. But for now, in this quiet moment, I could almost hear Grandpa Art's approving chuckle as the last notes of the record faded into silence.